Welcome to this special Emmy nomination episode of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you here, not from my home, but from Budapest in Hungary. I'm currently out here working on the World Athletics. It's baking hot, but it's one of the cities I used to love coming to during my 20 years traveling the world with Formula One, so it's good to be back. So I hope you enjoyed my other special episode in which I spoke with 3 of the VFX team that have now been nominated for their work on Andor. If you don't already know, it was available as a podcast and also as a video on the Filmumentaries YouTube channel, so do check it out. For this, the second special Emmy nominees episode, I got to speak with friend of the podcast and former guest, VFX animation supervisor Hal Hickel. You can check out episode 68 for that conversation, along with Grady Cofer, production visual effects supervisor on Mandalorian Season 3. We chat about their work on the show, the balance of innovation and tradition, the use of certain tools of their trade, and the collaborative nature of VFX work. So here's my conversation with Hal Hickel and Grady Cofer, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on.
Well, thanks for joining me, guys. It's a pleasure to talk to people whose work I admire always, and I do admire your work. I'm a big fan of the shows you've worked on, and Hal and I have spoken before about his career. Could you just explain to start with, so people know who I'm talking to, because this will be in a video and an audio version, who you are and what your job entails?
Sure. Well, my name is Grady Cofer, and I am the Visual Effects Supervisor on the production side for The Mandalorian. And what that means is, to try to capture that quickly, is you are taking the stories that your filmmakers have created, right? So Jon Favreau writes these wonderful scripts. And the first thing is you kind of go through all those scripts and you're trying to figure out how to tell this story visually and come up with different techniques, visual effects techniques, of course, animation techniques from Hal, and in the best way to tell that story. And then I'm working throughout pre-production, kind of developing, helping kind of develop those ideas, working with the virtual art department, previs team. And then, of course, we shoot the movie, and then the real fun starts, right? Then we go into post-production, and I oversaw that with a lot of vendors and present that work and collaborate with Favreau and Dave Filoni and Rick Fukuyama, the creative team, to execute those shots.
Great. And Hal?
I'm Hal Hickel, and I was the animation supervisor. So, sort of anything that moves, whether it's creatures, characters, droids, but also spaceships and other kinds of vehicles that can't be built for real, that we're doing in visual effects. My team will execute that. And as Grady said, we work with John to help tell his story and figure out the best way to do that. And so, we're frequently asked to not just move things, but figure out the best way to, frame them and what shots to, how we design our shots to tell the story well. And so it gets into a lot of different areas, but at its simplest, it's, bringing things to life. And that's sort of my department. And I want to give a shout out to Paul Kavanaugh, who he and I kind of split duties across this season in supervising the animation. So kudos to Paul as well.
Yeah, it's a very collaborative area that you work in. And with a show like this, it's won an Emmy previously for its effects work. And the audience, the expectations grow, and they hope that it will continue to improve, story-wise, character-wise, visually, or the audio, everything. And fans have grown attached to characters and storylines. And meeting those expectations and delivering a compelling story while still staying true to that sort of Star Wars essence must be a hell of a challenge.
God, that's the key to all of this, right? Because I think most people would agree this season was huge, right? It was pretty epic. And a lot of that just came from the kind of themes that John was exploring this time around. They were kind of bigger themes, rebirth and redemption and the reunification of all of the Mandalorians and stuff. So these were really, really big stories, and they did demand that the visual effects and the world building and the level of animation all kind of be elevated, right? Be kind of taken to a new level. But the challenge, of course, is to do exactly that, to really kind of push the envelope, but keep the show grounded, keep it kind of honest to true to what The Mandalorian has always been. And that is, yes, aiming for the highest level of visual effects and animation, but doing that while balancing with more kind of traditional, kind of practical things, the old school tricks that we grew up with, the animatronics and practical creature effects, model miniatures, all those really kind of charming old school tricks that make things feel more, lived in and real and authentic and kind of grounded, and hit that kind of nostalgic Star Wars feeling.
Yeah. I look at the sort of scale and scope of this show, and it just seems to grow season upon season. And, there are points where I kind of had to remind myself, this is a TV show. There's a Star Destroyer crashing. There are, dozens of Mandalorians descending for that final battle. It's just got just about everything in this. You go from environments with water and fire and lush greenery. Within caves, you have flying creatures, space battles, sabers, and holograms. You must feel like you've got all the toys in your toy box there at times.
Yeah, it's funny. The Mandalorian series is the first thing I worked on that was meant for the small screen. But that said, we've premiered 2 of the seasons, season 1 and then this one, season 3, at the El Capitan in LA and screened episodes on the big screen, and they look great. I don't think we're doing anything differently. I think that the main thing that I had to get used to on the show is that while the quality level the bar is just as high as anything I'd worked on before. To be honest, if people had come to ILM asking, or, any of our vendors asking for something less, I think people would really struggle with it anyways. They'd be like, what does that mean? How do we even do that? But still, the thing that I had really had to wrap my head around, even going back to season 1, was the volume of the work. It's massive. It's double even the largest tentpole summer films. It's double that. And we do the post-production, I don't know, I think in a similar amount of time that we do a big film, but it's double the amount of work. So the scale is really something to contend with. Fortunately, ILM has a great history, and Lucasfilm generally, with managing huge visual effects projects. They kind of pioneered that on the prequel films, Star Wars prequel films. Before those films, visual effects projects had never come close to that many shots, and those films really taught us how to do really huge, complicated programs like that, and it's only continued over the decades since. So that for me was the volume itself was one of the biggest challenges, that it's only grown series upon first season 1, season 2, now season 3. It's only gotten bigger. So.
And I would say in all of...
Go on. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, in all of that, I feel like John is a pretty good partner, and not just because he's a very clever storyteller, and he makes sure that the visuals that we're creating are kind of in support of and that story that he wants to tell and enhancing that story experience, but also because I kind of feel like he's a bit of a fan of visual effects in general. He has lots of experience. He has great instincts about what works and what doesn't. He's always interested in kind of the latest tools. So that helps, right? We in reviews and kind of collaborating with John and his team, we're very open about what's achievable, what we want to aim for, what's attainable. But we're definitely not afraid, and certainly ILM isn't afraid of aiming high.
ILM's got that long history of, pushing the boundaries of VFX. How does that kind of legacy kind of influence and bolster your your approach and mindset as a team working on, you know, the latest and greatest TV show?
Well, I mean, I feel like it's great to work on a show that does two things. It aims, it wants the highest level of visual effects and animation, but it also kind of honors the great traditions, you know, of the history of visual effects. So we kind of incorporate that a little bit into production. Like whenever we're breaking down a sequence, Hal worked on a great scene. He could talk about it, the kind of the great finale at the end of the season, where you have this battle, the space battle happening up above Mandalore, and all of these TIE fighters and bombers are attacking a light cruiser. And I remember, Hal, you talking about the kinds of paths that the actual TIE fighters could take whenever they were shot as miniatures, and how that could inform the kind of things we would do in animation. So it's kind of nice to have, in a way, not guardrails, but like parameters that are based on the way things were done in the past. And to me, that's when you watch it, knowing that these days we can kind of do anything we want, but do you really want to? It's kind of best sometimes to kind of honor and kind of live within that Star Wars world that, you know, that we all grew up with.
Yeah. We have loads of conversations about is it Star Warsy or not, and that could have to do with just the simple design of something. You know, those conversations are generally with Doug Chang and his group, between him and John. And but then, you know, when it gets to our work designing shots, or the way something's animated or framed or just used narratively, or you know, fits in the edit, there's a feel thing. There's kind of a style guide. But the fun part is we don't have to be religious about it. We try to, we always want to talk about it, because it can be easy to sort of sideslip into other, you know, something that feels like just say a shot of a spaceship arriving at a planet, something simple like that. It can easily feel like Star Trek instead of Star Wars if you, and it can be as simple as what the camera moved, how the camera framed the ship as it passed by, or whatever. So we're always having those conversations, and but like I said, we you know, John is perfectly game to try new things, and so it's fun. You know, this is not our work, but if you think of Ludwig Göransson's music for the series, that was an example where John went, you know, took a risk and went completely far afield of what had been established previously, and it works great. And so in smaller ways, in visual effects, we test those ideas and boundaries all the time. But as Grady said, it's nice to have kind of a bedrock, or like you said, guardrails that of an established universe and a feel. And we particularly, I think we look at the original trilogy more than anything else in terms of, you know, vibe wise. But John is, as Grady says, a great partner. He's what I call a curious director. There's some directors who kind of don't want to know how the sausage is made, as they say, when it visual effects, because they feel like they'll think too much about whether something's hard or easy or whatever, and they just want to be purely creative. I think, and there I could see merit to that. But John is not like that. He's a creative, curious director who is interested in processes, and partly because he always wants to be improving them so that he can get the most on screen that he can possibly get. Like if he wants to know if something is massively inefficient. It may look cool, but massively inefficient, then he knows that's drawing resources away from 5 other things he may want to include in the series. And he's great that way. He's a great partner that way. And we're constantly horse trading with him about, you know, well, this is going to be really difficult to execute this way, but if we did it this way, it'll probably look just as good. And then we'll have the ability to do all these other things. And he's great that way.
The efficiency is something that I often think about when I think about The Mandalorian, because of the big revelation, of course, in Series 1 was stagecraft, these giant LED screens that you could work with to kind of extend sets and shoot in camera. And, you know, I think a lot of people assume that it saves a huge amount of time, but at the same time, you've kind of had to flip the production workflows on their head, and you have to have the effects ready before the live action is shot. How does that kind of influence your work, and how has that changed from season 1 through to season 3? Is there more use of stagecraft, or less use, or better use?
I would say that we were a bit more selective this season. I think it's one of those things where every season you've learned something, and this is, full disclosure, this is my first season on the show. It was Richard Bluff, and did a fantastic job working with Hal in the first 2. But there's a lot to glean from that experience, and John has picked up on those things too. So it meant that during pre-production and working with the VAD, when we're seeing early versions of environments, we're kind of flying through environments and in VR and stuff, we'd say, you know what, this would be a great use of stagecraft technology, and I think so. We try to be a bit more targeted. That didn't mean we did less of them. We did about 60 loads. Some of them are duplicates, but it's quite a number of different environments. Some of my favorites are the ones that I think were the most clever use of the technology. Took place in episode 3. That was Isaac Chung's episode, which is, super Hitchcockian, very deliberate, like everything was very kind of planned out, and working with, it was Dean Cundy who shot it, who's brilliant. So we, it's very simple, right? There was the shot of Pershing when he's in his office space, right? He's in his cubicle, and he's just one of many, and, working in this kind of amnesty thing. And we built, I think we had about 6 cubicles that were practical, that were in the foreground, and that's on the volume floor, and it's just a nice set. And then beyond that, now we're replicating those same cubies kind of into the volume wall, and it's all virtual behind it. And we had actual characters kind of walking around. We had droids kind of sliding around, all live on the wall. It was all kind of triggerable action. But it's such a great, the repetition of forms, seeing kind of geometric forms in the foreground that kind of go off into the distance. But when you're in there and you're in kind of a box, and and things are more geometric, you don't know it. You don't know where you are. It's pretty immersive. So anyway, there were many cases like that. Of course, we did. As a rule, though, we still do all cockpit work in the volume. Especially with, Mando has shiny Beskar, and he's flying his shiny N1 with the big canopy and stuff. It's pretty imperative that you shoot that with real-time imagery for lighting and reflection. There's really no, blue screen just does not work for something like that. The Hyperloop in episode 6, in Bryce's episode on the planet of Plaisir, we had a whole environment loaded up where we could travel through the Hyperloop tube over that landscape, and pretty much everything, right? That we built the actual pot, but it's all glass. And then, of course, there's Mando with this shiny armor, and it's just reflecting everything in that environment as they travel. And most of those shots were non-effect shots, right? No VFX needed, which is great. Which means, Jamie, that all of the work that you've now preloaded, right? All the effort that you went into developing that environment, having the content team make it look as real, very realistic, and making it real time for the walls, pays off. Now you're getting shots just like you're on a location, and it's going right in your movie. That said, we got outside a lot this year. We didn't always just kind of jump in the volume. When we could go somewhere, if we could go to a location, we shot aerial footage in the all over the Isle of Skye, for the Kalevala dogfight. We shot lots of plates and did a lot of kind of data capture in Lake Powell for that kind of opening sequence. Anyway, so it's a mixture for the volume work this year.
Grady, you mentioned previs there, and I just wanted to direct the question to you, Hal, because previs has kind of changed the workflow of your business, and how How flexible are those tools in terms of giving the director the flexibility to change something late on? I mean, do you go back to previs, or does previs kind of get locked in and then you work on the kind of high-res assets from that point? Or can you always return to previs if you need to, make amendments or redo a shot in a way that wasn't initially conceived that way?
Yeah, well, we're constantly sort of revising that process. We've been working with Third Floor all along on the Mano series. They're great. One of the things that's, I don't know, unique, but unique to, at least to my experience on this show, is that, most of the shows I've been on previous is focused on big visual effects, big technically complex sequences to sort of help solve those technical problems. Whereas on Mandalorian, so far the task of previs has been to previs the entire episode, because it's not just about number one, to figure out what needs to happen on the volume, right? That's one of the issues with it, because you need to pre-plan, obviously, because you're front-loading all that creation of the environments and stuff. And yes, big visual effects sequences, but also just straight drama scenes. The reason being, John likes to kind of prototype the whole episode and get it all up and running in this rough form to evaluate just how it's working as a story, just purely as a filmmaking tool, not necessarily about solving technical problems. But what that means is that, the previous team, they have to do everything in the episode, as I said, even just straight dialogue scenes. So sometimes that means that a big, complex visual effects sequence that's maybe mostly CG, like a dogfight in space or something like that, the previs might have to kind of just be not a placeholder, but definitely not a blueprint for what comes later, because they kind of need to get on with the rest of the episode. And so then it'll come to my team either ahead of shooting, if there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, like a sequence like the turtle crocodile thing that attacks right at the beginning of the season. That was a sequence where we needed to hammer away at that before shooting started, so that they would know what stunt pieces to shoot, all the live action stuff kind of surrounding the creature and that are going to need to interact with it. We needed to know what the action was. We needed to come up with things like the death roll, the gator roll that it does, and things like that. So that was a situation where previs got it to a certain point, and then we in animation kind of took it on and continued to kind of beat on it until shooting started, and then went into a normal post-production sort of mode. Then there are other sequences, like, for instance, something maybe happening like a dogfight in space or something, where we kind of know what the interior cockpit pieces need to be, so we don't have to get the sequence perfect before shooting happens. And then we can continue to tweak and invent and polish some of the gags and things that happen in post-production. So it's kind of a whole mix. Personally, I prefer, whenever possible, to get the previs team to do revisions, whether it's ahead of shooting or even a little after, when we can. Again, sometimes they've had to move off onto the next episode or the next sequence or whatever, and we kind of can't steer them back, and we take that on and anim. So it's a whole mix, but it's a good relationship. And actually what we're trying to do going forward is for Grady and I to have more sort of tight integration with previs at the outset, to kind of steer that stuff so that it can get much closer to what it's going to be before shooting happens, and there's less tinkering that has to happen later. Because ideally, the previs does serve as a blueprint for everybody, for at least large issues, and so the closer you can get it to that, the better. So it's been evolving over the seasons in terms of when and where we get involved directly with them versus them working directly with the episode director or with John, and then visual effects engaging later. We're engaging now from the very beginning, and so it's been kind of nice evolution over the course of the seasons.
The evolution behind the scenes,
Yeah.
as you two as characters almost, yeah. The Mandalorian, has these big moments, but with effects work, you're always wanting to serve the story, you always wanted to serve the character. Yet you have these massive moments, with the like the dinosaur turtle thing that you mentioned, the Shriek Hawks. You've got the Mines of Mandalore scene. You've got that big final battle. How do you go about trying to find that balance between having these big wow moments, but not for them to be kind of distracting to the story itself?
Well, I think sometimes spectacle can, if that's all it is, and everything is kind of devoted to that scope and the visuals of kind of large scale epic shots and stuff, you definitely can lose sight of character threads and kind of the more personal stuff. A lot of this kind of comes from John, because he talks about when you kind of go large, but you always have to bring it back to something kind of personal. And of course, that's always been Grogu, right? Like all it takes is one close up of Grogu and a little, a look or a sound, and you're back to the personal. You're back to the relationship between Grogu and Mando, or Grogu and Bo. So I think some of it comes from shot design. Like I remember, this is episode 4. It's Carl Weathers' episode where you have this young boy, this Mandalorian, who's gonna, he's getting his helmet for the first time, and he gets snatched by the giant eagle. And of course, this is a big set piece. We've got jetpackers kind of flying around chasing it, and you could, it's very energetic, and there's a lot of great energy kind of in that scene. I remember actually how kind of in some of the early reviews, like with John, Paul Kavanaugh showing kind of early blocking, and immediately John was like, "Where's the camera? Like, how are you shooting this? How would you shoot this if you were shooting it for real? Like what technology would you use?" So the key was to kind of create kind of a cinematic language, a visual style that felt real, that felt kind of cinematic. So everything turned into air to air. It's like, helicopters following jetpackers on long lenses. We started doing the head-mounted cameras, like little GoPros, like on Paz Vizsla. So, which is great. So you get scope, you get wide. All of a sudden, you cut in tight, and now you're actually flying with Paz Vizsla. We do long lenses of the boy and the hand. So I really think it's about shot design, and inside of a big set piece that kind of keeps the actual narrative and the character story alive, even when the spectacle is so big.
Yeah, it grounds you, doesn't it? It gives you something to sort of tether yourself to, subconsciously probably for us as an audience, but great that intention is there from you guys behind the scenes. How some of the characters, of course, in Mandalorian are expressionless. Therefore, in your animation, you have to create expression, you have to create emotion. How much of a challenge was that to find within your work on this show?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. We went through a whole sort of exercise in that regard on Rogue One some back, where we were doing K2SO. And there was a desire at the outset of that project to explore a droid that might have facial expressions. And which, if you think about it, isn't very Star Warsy, because even the most anthropomorphic droids like C-3PO, their faces don't move. And if you're going to go down that path, you have to have a droid with very sophisticated facial movement to express anything. You can't just be eyebrows and, a mouth like smile and frown. Anyway, so we went through that whole thing, and it taught me a lot about how strong and important pantomime is, and the kind of what it is about a performance that connects with the audience and creates emotion. And obviously Alan Tudyk as K2SO is super funny, and his comic timing was brilliant. And we didn't, as funny as his face can be, he's got great expressions. We kind of didn't need it, especially if the audience never saw the footage of him and just saw K2SO. So anyway, flash forward to Mandalorian. Yeah, I mean, we have, and this isn't even my department, but we have lots of main characters who are faceless, pretty much all of them, including the main character. But we're frequently tasked with bringing sort of emotion and audience connection to things that don't have ordinary faces or don't have faces at all. I mean, you look at R2-D2, or in season 3 we had R5, who's Mostly practical, of course, it must be said. But, there are times when we have to do him animated and do little gags with him and things. And, I feel like those kinds of droids going all the way back to R2-D2 are an awesome example of communicating emotion and generating empathy with something that's completely unanthropomorphic. Doesn't have a face, arguably has an eye, but it doesn't blink. And you can get tons of expression and emotion out of characters like that. Even the little mouse droids, you can communicate fear, frustration, all kinds of things just with how they move and the little sounds that they make, which also plays obviously a huge role.
Yeah, I just wonder if your work, because of the expressionless characters of the Mandalorians, if your work in character animation has to be more amplified to kind of, set the balance or not.
I don't think so. It's funny. Like I said, I think most of it comes from body language. Like, you don't have to amp that up. You can. My Alexa's going off. You don't have to amp that up. I don't think to a sort of the way you would with an animated, like a cartoon-ish character, where you kind of push those things and actually downplay other things, like the naturalism. In those cases, you downplay, and the poses and things you really push and make kind of antic. I don't find we really have to do that. We're still living in a live action world. There's all kinds of levers you can pull to get, as I say, generate empathy and understanding and an emotional connection with the audience without having to sort of overdo it.
Yeah, sure. Looking, we talked about the sort of the changes that are made from season 1 to season 3 in terms of using the technology, using the tools at your disposal. Is some of that also about having, the time to kind of debrief at the end of a show's run, and then making sure you've assembled the right team for the job as well?
Certainly. I mean, I think, we learn every show we do, we learn something new from, and you start having ideas about, even while you're working on a show, you're like, oh, you know what, that's something really cool. We should file that away. And the next time we do this, let's try that out. There's always kind of new ideas. And yeah, we're, it's all about the people, right? Working with the right people, finding the right collaborations. Probably every season, and I wasn't on the first 2, there's been, some slightly new people that have kind of plugged into that, and that's great, right? New, fresh perspectives. We get that naturally with the episodic directors, like you just have all of a sudden someone comes in with, they all want to work in the Star Wars universe, but they have their own history and experience and vision, and it's great. And we learn from that, So I do think that there's growth from season to season, but it isn't like we sit around and say, okay, this didn't work. We don't do this. Let's reorganize and do it a different way. But hey, if there is a better way, and I think, like Hal was saying earlier, John is kind of interested in that and process, and he does. It's like, hey, you know what? If that didn't work last year or that was inefficient, as Hal was saying, let's change it. How can we do that better?
Yeah, I really enjoy getting to work with a whole slate of directors rather than just one on a project, because the relationship with directors is always enjoyable for me on projects. I always find that a really interesting part of the job, and you get a whole crew of them on a season, which is pretty neat. Peter Ramsey was awesome to work with this year or this season, and Rick is always great. He's gone from being sort of one of the directors to kind of running along with John this season 3 and writing a lot on it, and he's great. And it's always I really enjoy watching too when directors come in who maybe their background hasn't really had anything to do with visual effects or Star Warsy kind of stuff, and they have a really different sort of mode of working and thinking about things. But then John's always there to kind of mentor them in terms of best practices for interfacing with us and getting the best result in visual effects, and that's kind of cool to watch. The other thing I was going to say is, and this goes back a few questions back, I think what you were talking about, maintaining, when you've got big visual effects and you're trying to keep true to the story and the characters and all that. One of the things I'd like, at the risk of sounding like a suck up. One of the things I like about working with John and his dailies is he's got what I call feelings first dailies, which is that we'll play a sequence down for him to show him the latest animation, or in Grady's case, the latest comps and things, and what's happening. And John will never start by saying, "Oh, that third shot in, the contrast looked a little bit off," or that there was weird about the thing, or the creature doesn't feel like it has weight. Never starts there. He'll have notes. He'll say, "I've got some notes." Number one, he almost always defers to the episode director to see what they might have to say when they're involved with that stuff, or Rick, or Dave's on the call, Filoni, which is almost always. But then when John jumps in, he always starts with how the sequence made him feel, and of course, by extension, then how he expects it to make the audience feel, and whether it's achieving the stuff narratively, emotionally, et cetera, that he intends it to have. And we'll talk through all that stuff first, which, for one thing, I find it enormously educational for me, because we don't start talking about visual effects. We start talking about story and whether there's clarity, whether it's hitting the emotional beats, all that stuff gets talked about first. Then we drill down into, that this shot doesn't quite look real yet, or that creature's movement isn't right, or whatever. We get to that stuff last in the conversation. We get to it last. And I really like that, because for one thing, I think it's emphasizing what is most important, right? How is this making us feel? Let's not get into the weeds first. Let's take 10 back and talk about it. And I just really enjoy that. Also, he encourages, sort of all departments to speak up. It's perfectly okay for the editor or whoever to make a comment about a visual effects shot, and it's perfectly okay for us to propose a solution of, hey, what if we combine these two shots, or what if we took this shot out and put this over here? And it doesn't step on toes, and it's done in a respectful way and all that. But John just really encourages that kind of group communication in a structured way. It's not a free, and I just enjoy that so much. It's great, and I think it produces really good work. I really do. So,
yeah, leaving room for creativity seems to be something that ILM has had from the start, in a way. George employed people almost based on personality types, and it feels like there's still a bit of the essence of that still remaining. Grady, you oversaw all of the vendors that you work with, because this is not just an ILM production. You work with other effects houses. How do you go about sort of pulling all of those threads together, making sure that it's a cohesive visual aesthetic?
Yeah, a lot of it is, I'll say just right from the start, a number of these facilities have been working on Mando from the beginning. So they've learned, right? And they kind of know the brief, a lot of them. So hybrid, image engine, important looking pirates. These are really brilliant facilities that really generated some great work this season. So that helps. I like as a supervisor, because Hal's talking about how we're so kind of privy to kind of the big story, right? It's not just about the shot. We know when it gets down to the shot level, we know what we have to do to execute that. But I think even down to the artists, it helps to have kind of the big picture. This is what this story's about. This is the feeling we're trying. These are the emotional notes we're wishing to hit. And we show a lot of artwork. I love, because it's Doug Chang and his team, they generate these beautiful kind of concept art, dreams, imagescapes. So sharing a lot of that, so they kind of get the vibe. They're all kind of on board. They know the brief. That helps, right? Now everyone's kind of working to that same goal. And then really it's being, having lots of good open reviews, sharing work. Sometimes it's like, hey, you know what? That looks great. IOP was just doing something similar, and I thought that looked really cool. I'm going to send it to you. You know what I mean? Like, in some cases, I've even had reviews where I brought two vendors together, and because they're both maybe tackling something similar, and they can kind of, collaborate or coordinate and problem solve together. Team effort kind of stuff, Jamie. I think that's kind of what does it.
Yeah, sounds like an excellent approach. One of the questions I always avoid in my podcast when I'm talking to people about their careers, like when Hal and I spoke about his career, from start to where it currently is. One of the questions I don't ask people is, what is your favorite sequence? What is your favorite shot? But we're here specifically today to talk about a specific show and the fact that you've been nominated for this Emmy, which is fantastic. So is there a particular shot or sequence that you look at in season 3 and you think, wow, that's my favorite season? It might be a shot you didn't work on. It might be a shot that a different vendor worked on, or it might be an animation that Hal worked on. Is there something for you, Grady, that stands out?
There is. I mean, for me, there were lots of shots. We went to 8 planets, tons of unique environments and stuff. But for me, it was all about Mandalore this season. And, it's something, of course, the audience was really anticipating it, just because it's been talked about. You knew we had to go back to Mandalore, to go to Living Waters, to be redeemed. So that's a big thing. Anybody, all of the fans of the animated show, of course, they know the history of Mandalore, and of course they saw the Purge, in the last season. So it was something we just had to get it right, pretty much at every level. And again, Doug Chiang, they generated so much art for Mandalorian. It was just beautiful stuff, like really just imagery that's very soulful. And that descent, that initial journey where you follow Din, and it's really interesting when you think about it, because it starts, up in space, he's floating above and he's talking to, his son. And then you have this blanket of this massive storm, right? And then underneath that kind of reveals the landscape for the first time, and the devastation, and we call it the trinitite, like encrusted surface, which used to be sand, going all the way down into the mines, going down into the sewers, finding the living waters. So if you were to map that out, and we did, like we have this kind of chart, we were just following this descent. And to John, it's not just a physical descent. He wanted it to be kind of psychological too, like very imagistic, especially when we go underground, wanted it to be very nightmarish. So there was just a lot of very intentional design and development that went into us experiencing Mandalore and revealing that for the first time. The ruins of Sundari, that was a big shot. I'll just say it, that's one of my favorite shots. Important looking pirates just killed it, when you're seeing that domed city from above over Bo's ship. So yeah, for me, there was that, and it's where all of the cylinders are firing at the same time. I felt like all the filmmakers really knew exactly what they wanted to do. They got the tone just right, walking through the mines and through the sewers. That's probably the most rewarding out of this season for me, is kind of going back, and it was probably the most daunting in the beginning, but the most rewarding ultimately.
Great. And what about you, Hal?
I was kind of going in the same place. John brought Phil Tippett in to help design, particularly stuff around that sort of mech lair where the droid is with the mech spider thing, and that whole sequence and what we see in that went through a bunch of changes. There was some quite big changes, so it's tough. And Paul, that was a sequence Paul headed up and contributed some great ideas to, by the way, like when the head sort of pops off and crawls away back to the spider mech. That was a contribution of Paul's, and other things. But I like the design of the mech. I like the interior that Phil designed. I like the creepiness of it, and it, because it felt Star Wars, but almost a little like it was almost, we were expanding Star Wars a little bit in terms of what Star Wars can be. It's like Star Wars isn't often horror, it's other things. It can be comedy, it can be, dramatic space opera and things, but it isn't often horror. And I felt like we were kind of dipping a toe into that world with just visually and everything, and how creepy that spider is, and it grabs Mando and puts him in that thing. And so I really dug all that stuff, because I felt like we were kind of expanding what Star Wars could be, and at least in the live action world, a bit. And I just liked Phil's whole contribution to it, and the whole creepy environments that he designed. He built miniatures of them, like 6 scale, I think, so pretty big, but dressed with all the weird little artifacts and objects and creepy things, and it really gave a nice creepy touch to all that stuff.
And John loved all of that, right? Didn't he? He just all of the weird totems that they had designed, and the creepy, like, it looks like a root, but it almost looks like entrails on the floor. You don't know what's kind of mechanical or what's organic. It's really cool, creepy stuff. And we actually scanned a lot of those pieces from the miniatures and incorporated that into our 3D scenes, so we could kind of we literally just took his models and kind of added them to the shots.
Well, for what it's worth, those two scenes that you've just mentioned are my two favorite scenes of the series as well. Got them written here down next to me. So yeah, no, thank you so much for your time today, and thanks for the work you do. People are sitting on this side of the screen and really enjoying what you've been doing these last few years with the TV shows, and let's hope there's plenty more where that came from, because yeah, we're ready to lap it up.
Coming soon to a TV near you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Hal and Grady. Big thanks to them and to ILM for organising the interview. Coming up next, there will be a third and final special Emmy nominee episode in which I talk with some of the Skywalker sound artists and technicians, namely Danielle Dupree, Matthew Wood, and fellow podcaster and sound designer David W. Collins. That will be out before the end of this month, August 2023. If you like the podcast, please consider supporting it. For just $12 per year, you could help me produce a minimum of 24 episodes, and I reckon that's pretty good value. Search at filmumentaries.creator-spring.com. I'll put a link of that in the show notes. There's also an Etsy shop where you can buy exclusive Inside Jabba the Hutt prints. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, the YouTube channel, the Facebook page, on Instagram, and I'm on Twitter at JamieSWB. All the others are Filmumentaries, but Twitter is JamieSWB. You kind of get stuck with what you started with on there. And I think that's everything. So next month, it'll be my conversations with VFX Supervisor Pablo Hellman, with the BFI's Douglas Weir. I've also still got my conversations with sound wizard Max Smith and VFX artist Charmaine Chan. So you've got plenty more episodes to come and several more in the pipeline. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.